Welcome back. This is Week 3, Lecture 1, The World of the Greeks. Now, with this lecture, we begin to enter a period that is somewhat more familiar to us because, in so many ways, whereas ancient Mesopotamia, there are not a lot of remnants or echoes of ancient Mesopotamia in our society today. Greek culture and Greek thought is still very much present with us. Greek mythology, Greek philosophy, Greek literature. And so we begin to really see ourselves as children of the Greeks, so to speak, or at least inheritors of the Greek tradition. I'm just going to be going through a few of the elements that comprise the world of the Greeks in this lecture. But this lecture will most likely be a rather long lecture. And next lecture maybe as well, but I'll address that when I get there. But with this lecture, I may by intent do it in two parts. Not because I click on something or hit something and screw up the whole process and have to start again, but simply because it's okay, let's take a break, also for me, but also for you. Don't worry about this in terms of the time, even though this week, the time for lectures this week will most likely exceed the time that we would have if we were meeting in an in-person class, which is an hour and 15 minutes per session, so 2 hours and a half. These two lectures together may run over 2.5 hours. This lecture will most likely run over an hour and 15 minutes, but we'll see how it goes. The time will be caught up later on. Next week will be another workshop, and that will be relatively short comparatively, not only comparatively to this lecture, but also compared to the last chat on the workshop History Lab, because I will not be doing all the prefatory setting the ground, the stage, so to speak, the groundwork, the stage for the workshop. We'll just be getting right into it. But anyway, the whole point is, please bear with me because this is a really important lecture, the entire thing, however long it may take. And it's also important because your term paper, I'm assuming that you've been aware of the term paper and have already acquired a copy of Plato's Republic, is on Plato. And this lecture will be dealing with Plato as well. So for all these reasons, I think it's, I don't want to bother you or worry you, but this lecture will probably be longer than the hour and 15 minutes. But we'll see how it all goes, and then just hang tight, because overall, I think the time of the lectures will work itself out. Anyway, that being said, the issue of the Greeks in our society, from architecture and art to the literature, all the way through, as I've already said, is still very much present with us. And in so many ways, the way the Western mind thinks is a development that stems from the Greeks. So we'll be looking at some of those developments as we go through. That being said, we are going to first, real quickly, look at the different periods of Greek history and then look at the concept of Greek identity, because today we talk about the Greeks, but yet the Greeks were not a single, unified political entity. It wasn't like Greece. Greece, again, was a modern development. But the Greek-speaking peoples were so important. And even though they were distinct city-states, because within the region of what is today Greece, more or less, the Peloponnese and so, they were fighting constantly, as we'll see and we'll be talking about. And there was a concept for the first time that we see in the extant evidence in the sources of we are the West. We are the civilized. And people out there are the barbarians. Now that concept, which developed in the course of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, for me in this course is an extremely important one. It's a demarcation. It's a duality between us, the Greeks, the civilized, and them, the outsiders, the barbarians. Now, the term barbarian originated with the Greeks. And what it referred to for the Greeks was not the uncivilized as such necessarily. Today, how many of you would say, I'm a barbarian? It's not necessarily something that we would claim for ourselves. Yet we all are. Because for the Greeks, the barbarians were those people who did not speak Greek. Those who did not speak Greek to the Greeks sounded to the Greeks like they were just simply saying bar, 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 bar. Because of that, they were named the barbarians. And that means those who did not speak Greek. Yet that dichotomy, that distinction between not so much the Greeks and the barbarians, but the civilized and the barbarians, because that's how the distinction came to be seen, developed from the time of the Greeks. In some ways, it's all the way defining us today in terms of our divisions and things. And it has to do with language. But that gets into all kinds of things I'm not going to go into right now. But also in terms of Greek history, what we think of as Greek and ancient Greeks was actually basically just a single period of Greek history, classical Greece. And if you look at the slide on the PowerPoint that I have up there for you, periods of Greek history, we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 distinct periods of Greek history. And the earliest is the Minoan and Mycenaean, from approximately 3000 BCE to approximately 1100 BCE. And the Minoan and Mycenaean cultures were very important. The textbook talks about them. The earliest evidence we have for the Minoan civilization is very difficult to get a lot of information because the sources are so few, or also archaeological sources are so few. And then for around approximately 1100 to 1100 BCE, Greece entered what we call the Greek Dark Ages. Now, the term Dark Ages so often is used to refer to medieval Europe, and when we get there, I will go off on my high horse how that is absolutely not the case, and I forbid anyone to use the term the Dark Ages to refer to the European Middle Ages, and I'll explain all that when I get there. Why we call this period of Greek history the Dark Ages of Greece is because there are no sources. We can't see into this period from approximately 1100 BCE to approximately 750 BCE. And the datings are not set and clear and precise. They're give or take a couple hundred years on each side. But the issue is we don't have the sources. And I've already talked about how historians write in the present based on extant sources. And when the sources aren't there, we can't say anything about it. We don't have a window. We have nothing that signifies that which no longer exists. So we can't really say what was going on in Greece in, let's say, 900 BCE. We don't know because the evidence is not extant. And then all of a sudden, around 750 BCE, 800 to 750, sources begin to reemerge. Now, what I mean by that is not that in that period there were no sources that were written or created or made or structures that were being built. It's like what has still exists today, or at least into modern times. Just as an example, I'll be talking a lot about this today in this lecture, the city of Troy and the Trojan War. As you'll see on the slides, we'll be talking about the Trojan War. The Trojan War, until the mid or later 19th century, was seen as simply a myth, a bunch of stories. It comes from Homer, and Homer is one of the earliest sources we have for the beginning of what's called the Archaic period of Greece, the time from when it's coming out of the Dark Ages. And Homer is a very ambiguous figure, or just enigmatic, because historians debate, and we aren't even sure that there was a single person called Homer. He has these two epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, that are attributed to somebody named Homer. And it's even been theorized that the Iliad and the Odyssey had two different authors, one of which was a woman, not a male. But traditionally, Homer was a blind poet, and I'll be talking more about that later on, a blind bard. And he writes these amazing pieces of literature, these epic poems. And it's not simply a poem. I mean, some of you, if not all of you, maybe have already read one or both, or at least parts of one or both. And these are really foundational texts for the Western tradition. He talks about Troy. He talks about the Trojan War. There was no evidence until Schliemann, a German archaeologist historian, in the 19th century discovered Troy and excavated it and found, yes, here is a city, more or less, where the literary sources have claimed it was, that seems to be called Troy, and seems, based on the archaeological evidence, to have been destroyed. So Troy was excavated and found and discovered. So there really was a Troy. And it seems that there very well may have really been a Trojan War. That does not mean that the stories that Homer told or all the other stories about the Trojan War were true. It simply means that there was a historical factual basis for those stories. And that is really when we begin to come out of, when the history of Greek came out of the Dark Ages and entered what we call the Archaic period, which is just archaic as an early development, very much going through it. And that lasts till approximately 500 BCE. And then around 500 BCE, we enter what historians refer to as classical Greece. And this is really what we think of today in the image that we have of ancient Greece, is really from classical Greece, this period from approximately 500 BCE to approximately 350 BCE. This is the period of the great development philosophically, with literature too, which I'll be talking about shortly, political developments. I'll get to this later on in the lecture as well, but so often it's been said that democracy was discovered by the Greeks and developed by the Greeks, and yes, it was also during this period. But we'll talk about the Greek understanding of democracy as opposed to our understanding of democracy, because they're very, very different. But we'll get there before too long today. And then there's the Hellenistic period, from 350 to what do I have up there, to about 200 BCE. This is the spread of Greek culture. Now, if you already know something about Greek history, this is the time of Alexander the Great, who kind of conquers Greece, and then with his empire, the empire of Alexander, conquers a lot of the known world at the time, not all of it. He didn't really get through all of India, but he spread Greek culture. We'll be talking more about that, because that is still just at the time where Rome, which will be the focus of next lecture, is emerging and developing as a world power. But we'll get there with Rome when we get there. But the spread of Greek culture throughout the Mediterranean and beyond was a very significant development, and as part of the periodization of ancient Greek, the history of ancient Greece, of ancient Greek history. So that's what we're looking at. And of course, during this classical Greek period too was the great Peloponnesian Wars between Sparta and Athens, as well as at the beginning of the classical period was the Persian Wars, where the Greeks really did unite against the Persian Empire. And this is going to be very important for what I'm getting to, building up to for the next slide in terms of Greek identity, because there was a unity, again, based on language, even though we're fighting each other all the time, that we're all Greeks. We all speak the same language. We're part of the same family, and the Persians are separate and different, and we'll see how that plays in. The Persians are the barbarians. They don't speak Greek. So we Greeks are going to come together and unify to defeat the Persians, which they did. And then Sparta and Athens, the two most powerful leading city-states in ancient Greece, fought a series of wars known as the Peloponnesian Wars that basically, even though that Athens kind of supposedly won, it kind of, or actually Sparta kind of won. They went back and forth. They basically beat each other up and killed and destroyed everything. But we'll be getting into a little bit of that later on today. But that's one of the things that led to the transformation of classical Greece into Hellenistic Greece. The defeat of, or the aftermath of the Peloponnesian Wars, and the consequences thereof, which we'll see, which were far more than simply political and militarily, and then the rise of Alexander. Now, that is in broad terms the outline. Now, I talked about the Trojan War, I did, and this gets to Greek identity because the Trojan War, which again is dated to around 1200 to 1100 BCE, which ended this Minoan-Mycenaean period of Greek history, because it was really Mycenaean Greece in which during which the Trojan War took place, and also was the basis for this distinction between us, or the Greeks, or the civilized, and the barbarians. Homer writes about it. Not Homer, excuse me, Herodotus, the father of history, supposedly. Homer writes about the Trojan War, but Herodotus in the 5th century already, mid-5th century, during the classical period of Greece, writes his history of the Persian Wars. And what he says about it is that, it all started based on the capture of Helen. Helen, commonly known as Helen of Troy. But Helen of Troy was the wife of the king of Sparta, Menelaus. So what did they do? And Herodotus goes back and forth and says, it's kind of ridiculous. What this was all about, because the abduction of women goes all the way back. Goes all the way back to the Phoenicians, and it goes back and forth. In terms of Phoenicians, part of the Greeks, Phoenicia, not part of the Greeks, but part of the barbarians for the Greeks. Because women, this is at this point not an inclusive understanding, because it's, the Greeks were not inclusive understanding peoples. Women were very important to ancient societies. Why? Because they gave birth, and population and the continuation of population was seen as a need, a drive, a good for the society and the culture. And so if one culture or society said, we need more women, or better women, or stronger women, or more beautiful women, or whatever, we can just go take them from somewhere else. So there was a whole process, according to Herodotus, of the abduction or kidnapping of women, and Helen was then supposedly kidnapped. And there were already stories about that. There's no evidence that Helen was a real person. I honestly don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to go and look, and I didn't before giving this lecture, whether or not there's evidence that there was a king of Sparta named Menelaus. That could be, because there could be evidence of that. But if there is, it doesn't mean that the historical Menelaus had anything to do with the literary creation of Menelaus. But for Helen, it's almost there's no historical evidence. There's literary evidence with Homer, because Homer talks about Helen, and then Herodotus talks about Helen as being the origins of the conflicts between, as he put it, the Greeks and the barbarians, because it was the first time that the Greeks achieved victory over the barbarians. Now, what Homer was doing was reading the events, or not so much the events, but the experience of the Persian War back into the Trojan War. Because for Herodotus, not for Homer, but for Herodotus, I'm sorry, I keep getting this mixed up. For Herodotus, the Persian War was when the Greeks unified against the quote-unquote barbarian East. And that's how Herodotus portrayed it. But he portrays it going back to the Trojan War. It says it's the first victory of the Greeks over against the barbarian East. That later was then echoed again in the 4th century by the author Isocrates, not Socrates, but Isocrates, who wrote a speech, an encomium on Helen, praising Helen and saying Helen is the very identity of being Greek. Helen shows us what being Greek really means, and that is this unifying force against the enemy who's going to take something from us, because Helen brought us all together. Helen is really the symbol of Greek identity. If we want to know what does it mean to be Greek as opposed to being a barbarian, we look to Helen and the Trojan War. Now, it's this literary creation of this mythic figure, and here when I'm saying mythic, what I'm meaning is, number one, no historical evidence for, but number two, the basis of a significant historical mentality and ideology of who we are, expressing a reality and a truth, even if not an historical truth. I use the term mythopoetic truth. There are various different realms of truth or means of identifying truth. And historical, literal truth is one thing. Scientific truth is one thing, and scientific truth and historical truth are very closely aligned, I would argue, and we'll be arguing as we go through things, as I did with history as science and art. So it's that literal scientific understanding of history, that history as art must be based on. But there also then this mythopoetic. Poetry is true, even if not literally true. It expresses a truth, an experienced truth. And that is what all the stories and accounts of Helen were doing, expressing an experienced truth in the story of a myth, in the Greek sense of mythos. In Greek, it's a Greek term. They gave us the term myth that expresses a reality. It's a story. A mythos is a story. So it's a story that expresses a truth, even not in a literal way. So now I'm going all around this topic. We need to look more specifically, because this whole issue of the East, the barbarian East against us, then by implication, the West, I mean, neither Herodotus nor, as Socrates, say that we Greeks are the West, but they talk about the barbarian East, is an ideological construct. If you remember in one of the early lectures, first lecture I think it was, I put up the map from 1598 in terms of the Eastern and Western Hemisphere, and there the Eastern Hemisphere was the Old World, and the Western Hemisphere was the New World. So obviously at that point, Europe and Greece were all part of the East, the Eastern Hemisphere. But why I put that there and talked about it was that these designations, East and West and whatever have you, are based on ideology, not geography, because East can only be determined geographically based on a point of reference, a point of observation, as I've talked about, where you are. Because where you are, East is directional from where you're standing or where you are looking at, or from your perspective at the time. So it is relational. It's not an absolute construct. And that's the same thing for this dichotomy between us, the civilized, the West, Greeks, and the barbarian East. But that's where this whole concept and idea of Western and Eastern, civilized and uncivilized, the barbarians, emerges, and then it changes as we go through time over who considers themselves as Western or as civilized. Because somehow then civilization and those that are civilized are part of Western civilization. So in some ways, there's a very strong argument to be made that Western civilization itself begins with the Greeks. Even though civilization, as I talked about in previous lectures, as a form of human culture existed beforehand. Now, I will be arguing that Western civilization, as such, it took a long time before it becomes uniquely and distinctively Western, even though Greece, we can see the real origins thereof with this distinction that we can see as the basis for this distinction between us versus them. And we can say this goes back all the way back to early, even pre-Homo sapien human cultures in terms of tribes and groups, warrior bands. That's like us. We are here. You can see that as some of the earliest developments of civilization with the developments of a wall. This demarcation between us and them. But the first time we find it articulated is with the Greeks. In terms of it being ideological rather than geographical, here we have the map, and this comes next to the beginnings of historic Greece between 700 and 600 BCE, so just as it's in archaic Greeks. And this is, I forget when this map is from, it's an old map, but it's not really, doesn't mean it's not accurate. If you look at the colored areas in the yellow and green, you see the area occupied by tribes there in the key, the beginnings of historic Greece. Area occupied by allies, political leagues, great states, the Delian Amphictony. I'm not even sure what that is. Anyway, but that's that black line. That's part of the Delian League that formed to defeat Persia. Okay. Now, it's just kind of that. Here we see Athens. If we look straight ahead with this black line on the left aspect of it, we see Athens and Attica. And then we go across. If you look at the 38th parallel, go across from Athens to the 26th line of longitude. And then you go straight up and you see Lesbos. Now, Lesbos was a Greek city-state. And the great poet Sappho was from Lesbos. And if you go straight up from Lesbos along that 26th parallel, or not parallel, but 26th line of longitude, you find Tenedos, that little island there. That island, Tenedos, that is Troy. Tenedos is Troy. And then if you look further, go back down to Lesbos and go further east, you still find, then eventually we follow that black line around, Ionia, Samos, Miletus. If you go further down, you find Rhodes. These are all Greek city-states and part of, quote-unquote, Greece, and it's all east of Troy. So they were not meaning that the barbarian East is Troy and that we are the West geographically. The Greeks were, they're great, especially the Athenians were great sailors, the navigators. They knew their geography of their own region anyway extremely well. They knew that there were Greek city-states east of Troy. It is an ideological distinction, and that is so important. So, I've spent a lot of time on this kind of context for approaching this idea of Helen, the symbol of Helen as a symbol of Greek identity. Let's go more into some of the details. The Trojan War, which I've already talked about. Now, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, some of the earliest mentions of Helen we find within the Iliad, we find discussion of Helen. I think it's in the start of book 2, when the Greeks have gone to Troy to besiege Troy to get Helen back. And there was Menelaus, there was Agamemnon, his brother, and Helen is with Priam, the king of Troy, because Priam was the father of Paris. Paris was the younger son of Priam. Achilles was his older son. Hector, Hector was his older son. And Paris and Helen were together. So the first time we see Helen in the Iliad, we find it starts with Priam behind the walls of Troy, looking out over the landscape and seeing the Greeks encamped there as they had been for 10 years. And saying, is that person down there? Is that really Agamemnon? He says, go get Helen, because we need Helen to identify whether that is Agamemnon or Menelaus or it's just somebody we don't really need to worry about. Now, Helen was in her room weaving. That's important. We'll see that also with Penelope in the Odyssey, or actually I'm not going to go into the Odyssey very much here and now, but Penelope was weaving in the Odyssey. And weave in Latin origins is the same word as basically a text. Textus originally meant also a weave, a textile. That's where we get the term textile, which is cloth, which is woven cloth. Textile has the same etymological root of text. So what do we do when we create a text? We are weaving things together. Anyway, Helen, they brought up to the wall. And so Priam is there. And Priam says, Helen, my dear, is that Menelaus? She says, no, Father Priam, referring to Priam as her father's, because her partner at the time is Paris, also referred to as I said, Alexander. Paris. Yes, that is. Why was it that I left my husband? Because Menelaus had been her husband. My husband, my girls of my own age, to follow your son here to Troy. She says, slut that I am. All of a sudden, Helen was reflecting on her own actions when she says in the Iliad that I followed your son here to Troy. If any of you have seen the movie Troy, please expunge it from your minds. It is not really historically very accurate. There are two different accounts in terms of how Helen got to Troy. The one in the Iliad, slut that I am, Helen running off with Paris, and the other that Paris kidnapped her, basically. But there's a rationale for that, and that comes from what is known as the Judgment of Paris, which actually comes from Hesiod, another Greek author, not from Homer and not from Herodotus. Hesiod talks about this Judgment of Paris also to explain how did Helen of Sparta, the queen of Sparta, become the wife, the partner of the son of the king of Troy. So it was theorized, according to Hesiod, known as the Judgment of Paris, that it all started with what we can say is the first evidence of a beauty contest in heaven, because these are all Greek goddesses. Hera, who is the wife of Zeus, Athena, who is the daughter of Hera and Zeus, or at least of Zeus, came out of Zeus's head, and Aphrodite started arguing over who was the most beautiful. Well, we need to have somebody, judge for us, tell us who is the most beautiful. Is it me, Hera? My God, I'm the wife of Zeus. Was it Athena? Oh, or is it Aphrodite? Now, Athena is the goddess of war, and Aphrodite is the goddess of love, and other things as well. It gets very complex. So let's ask Paris to judge. Paris is the young man, red-blooded, son of Priam. So if you're Paris, what are you going to say? You say, sure, I'll be the judge of a beauty contest between you three. But then the goddesses thought, oh, okay, now a decision is going to make. We better try to, make sure we win, or I win. But all three of them are feeling this way. So they bribe Paris. And they say, Paris, or at least Hera goes to Paris, hey bud, hey dude, if you vote for me, I will grant you sovereignty over all of Asia. Paris goes, whoa, that's pretty good. Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Thanks, Hera. Athena then comes to him and says, Paris, if you come vote for me, I will make it that you will never lose in war. Paris is like, That's even better than sovereignty over Asia. My God, if I can never lose in war, I can conquer everything. You kind of screw my brother Hector, I'll be the conqueror of the world. But then Aphrodite comes. And Aphrodite says, Paris, if you vote for me, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you Helen as your wife. Now, Helen of Sparta, the wife of Menelaus, was seen at the time as the most beautiful woman ever to have lived. So when Aphrodite offers Paris Helen, Paris is like, yes. Now, Paris, as a red-blooded young male, whom do you think he chose? He chose Aphrodite. It's like, what a complete idiot. Whom should he have chosen? Athena, of course. Because if you can never lose in war, he could just go and taken Helen. But no, he was like, yeah, Helen. And so kidnapped Helen and brought her back to Troy. It's a very problematic story because we don't know what really happened. And there's a problem because if Helen is the symbol of Greek identity, was Helen abducted? Oh, poor me, Helen. Oh, save me from my kidnapper. Or was Helen like, you know what? I know I'm the most beautiful woman in the world and I'm stuck with this older guy, Menelaus. And Paris is this really gorgeous young guy. I'm going to go follow him. According to Homer in the Iliad, that self-reflection of Helen as the slut that I am is based on that version, that I, Helen, ran off because, yay, Paris. And why did I do that? Why did I do that? That was not a moral virtue for anyone at the time. And if that is the symbol of Greek identity, is it then this idea of immorality, basically? There's a lot of ways to argue for that. But what does it mean that Helen of Sparta went off willingly to follow her lover or desired lover, Paris, to go to Troy, leaving everything behind? Calling herself a slut. Is that the Greek identity? Or is the Greek identity this abduction based on Helen having been kidnapped? And in some ways, there's very much a reason to claim it was based on abduction, because here too, when we get there, but I'm going to bring it in here, as I already said, Homer talks about, or Herodotus talks about, this history of abduction. One of the stories of Zeus was that he abducted women. I mean, Zeus, one of the good things about being God is you can do whatever you want, it doesn't matter. And Zeus, I forget how many lovers he had, both male and female, a lot. But he set his eye on this Phoenician princess. Phoenicia, where Herodotus said it all started. And so as the story goes, Zeus changed himself into the shape of a bull, went down to Phoenicia, and abducted this Phoenician princess and brought her to Crete, to Greece. The name of this Phoenician princess was Europa. Now, before I came to what is now IU Indianapolis, I was at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville for a couple of years. And there, displayed in a courtyard, so to speak, but very prevalent structure on building or place on campus, was the statue of Europa in the bowl. And my point in this is that these stories of Greek mythology are still with us. In Tennessee, there was the story of Europa riding this bull. That was Zeus. Now, if think about it, it's like, if Zeus is Zeus, why does he have to transform himself into a bull? Maybe he's just playing around. But anyway, the whole origins of, let's say, bringing Europe to Crete or to Greece was an abduction, something that Zeus stole from the east in Phoenicia and brought to the west in Greece. Now, from there, the term Europa began to be referred to as the Greek mainland. So Europe originally was a Phoenician princess, then it became a general term for the Greek mainland, before it then became Europe as we know it today by extension. Always moving west from Phoenicia to Crete to Greek mainland to Europe as we know it. So there's this theme of abduction, and that means also violence and stealing, basically. Is that the origins of the civilized Greeks opposed to the barbarians? Is it because the civilized Greeks abducted and stole from the barbarian East to enrich themselves one way or the other? All these things make this whole story very ambiguous and not such as something that is necessarily this great thing of virtue. Who was Helen then? Helen of Troy, the partner or wife of Paris, or Helen of Sparta, originally that, or Herodotus had a way of dealing with this problem also to preserve Helen's virtue. Because if Helen went running off with Paris, her virtue was undermined and questioned, and thereby the virtue of the Greeks. If Paris kidnapped her, that also shows a weakness of the Greeks. So do we really want kidnapping to be part of what we are? I mean, we do the kidnapping, supposedly. We are not the kidnapped. That's not who we are. So Herodotus said he did a lot of work, did a lot of research. Also in Egypt, he went and talked to people in Egypt, and we talk a lot about how Herodotus is the father of history. But this is one of the ways, because he actually supposedly did research to look into what was the truth behind the stories of the Persian Wars. But he says that in the research that he did in Egypt, he discovered that Helen never even made it to Troy. Because on the way back from Sparta, Helen was on the ship with Paris. There was a storm, there was a shipwreck, and they were shipwrecked in Egypt. And they were rescued by the Egyptians, brought to the local leader. And the local leader says, like, okay, who's this? Oh, this is, Helen. Well, where Helen? Oh, it's the wife of Menelaus. Oh, how dare you? He said, first of all, that is despicable. And if you were not a victim of tragedy based on crashing, your sinking of the boat, sea tragedy, we'd basically put you to death for this crime of stealing a man's wife. But we also have the law and the rule that we will always offer hospitality and save victims of sea disasters. So, Paris, you get yourself back to Sparta. Or, excuse me, get yourself back to Troy. Helen stays here. So the whole point of Herodotus' story was that throughout the Trojan War, Helen was not even there. She was in Egypt, being kept safe for Menelaus until Menelaus could come and pick her up, basically. So then the problem, this is with other sources too talking about this, was that how did that work? How did it work that Helen was in Egypt, and yet the whole Trojan War was about Helen? And we know that Helen, according to Homer in the Iliad, appeared on the wall before Troy. Because one of the things that Homer writes is when Helen came out on the wall, all the Greeks who had united to come get her back saw her and were like, oh my God, she is gorgeous. That's why we're fighting. And she's the famous line in the face that launched 1,000 ships. So what was that if Helen was actually in Egypt? Now, the answer given was that basically it was a ghost. It was an image, an eidolon, an image of Helen that was in Troy, appearing on the walls overlooking the Greek soldiers besieging Troy that Priam was asking. It was not the real Helen. It was an idea, an image, an idea of Helen that led to the Trojan War. That's important. So we have Helen of Troy, Helen of Sparta, Helen of Egypt, Helen as an idea. And all of these different understandings of Helen are ambiguous. But the symbol of Greek identity then is ambiguous. What does it all mean? How do we hold it up as something to be proud of? And this makes us Greeks. It distinguishes us from those barbarians out there. But if that is an ambiguous, morally, politically, whatever you want to call it, in any different way, we can't have that be part of our identity, because that's what we're getting at. Identity. Who are we? And so somehow for the Greeks, Helen is central to the concept of Greek identity of who we are, even as there was no unity, except for that brief period where the Greeks united against the Persians in the Persian Wars that Herodotus was researching and writing about and trying to discuss the origins of and how it all worked out. That is why I spend so much time on Helen, because of how she is represented, the myth of Helen, the myth of Greek identity, which is the story, again, a mythos for who we are. And that just continues. That's why myth, too, is so important for me in this course, because stories about who we are central to our understanding of ourselves and identity. And that is, too, what history, in some ways, is about. That's the art of history. Now, when we divorce the art of history from the science of history, that's when we get into the realm of just fantasy and make-believe. That being all said, it also points to other aspects of the ambivalence of the Greek world, which was expressed by the Greeks in their concepts of tragedy. Sophocles, you may have read some of Sophocles, the great playwright from the 5th century. He lived basically throughout the 5th century. I have his dates written down here, from approximately 497 to approximately 406. So he lived throughout the 5th century, this great 5th century, from the beginnings of the emergence of classical Greek all the way through. And he wrote what's known as the Theban plays, the Oedipus cycle around King Oedipus. But Oedipus, the play Oedipus is simply one of three. It's also Oedipus Antigone and Oedipus at Colonna. So there's a cycle of 3 plays. But Oedipus is the most famous. If you haven't read it, which you very well may have, you probably have heard of at least the Oedipus complex of Freud. How the Oedipus complex for Freud was that we male children have this fantasy of killing our father and sleeping with our mother. And when Freud suggested that, it was like, ooh, and often still is, ooh. I mean, Freud was more sophisticated. If I teach 114, and if you take my 114 class, we'll talk more about Freud. But that idea, that concept is like, oh God. And so Freud's whole point is the origins of all psychoses resolves for males in the unresolved Oedipal conflict, the Oedipal conflict of son fighting against father for the mother. And if we look at literary discussions, we find this fratricide and patricide, killing of brothers and killing of fathers, the origins of many origin stories. Anyway, that gets into bigger things that we're not quite dealing with here. But this all comes back from the figure of Oedipus. Now, when Sophocles writes the Oedipus cycle or the Theban plays, he did not create the concept or idea of Oedipus or the character of Oedipus. Oedipus is already in Homer. Homer mentions Oedipus, and especially Tiresias. I'll get back to that in a second. And talks about how he was one of the people that Odysseus in the Odyssey saw in the underworld was Tiresias. These are old stories, ancient stories going back to the Minoan and Mycenaean period that are being handed down orally, just as Homer, when he starts writing in the 750 or so, he's not making all that up. These are oral traditions. As I said, Homer was called the blind bard because supposedly he was blind, and bard is somebody who goes around and tells stories, sings, etc. That's how these stories were transmitted over these hundreds of years, orally. And when we transmit things orally, they change and evolve and are adapted, even if we've memorized the basic text. It was all Homer then that, quote unquote, wrote them down. And in Homer in the Odyssey, when Odysseus has to go to the underworld to find his way back home, there is Tiresias. Now, Tiresias was a blind seer, fortune teller, future teller, S-E-E-R, which is really is seer, but he was blind. Homer was blind. Was Homer then trying to equate himself with Tiresias? Maybe. The whole issue of blindness and sight, because Tiresias, just like Homer, could see how to write the Odyssey and the Iliad. Tiresias, as the seer of truth and of reality and of the future, was a seer. Blind seer. That's like, wait a minute, that's contradictory. That gets at ambiguity, and that gets at the whole concept in some ways that gets at what it meant to be Greek in ancient Greeks, and that is tragedy. And the idea of the tragic, which is based on the ambivalence of ideals. Ideals, and this is something I've struggled with all my life in some ways. I'm an idealist. I'm not necessarily proud of it. Part of me, I love being an idealist. But I also hate it because it is ideal. One of the problems about ideals, they're never realizable. That's part of the conflict. This inherent conflict of the ideal. How do we handle it? How do we deal with it? And Greek tragedy dealt with it, with this tension, because what we find in Greek tragedy is a story, there's drama, playing it out in drama, a story about a hero, an ideal, having an ideal, but having a tragic flaw. There's no hero without a tragic flaw. There's no tragedy without a tragic flaw. So how does this all relate to Oedipus? Well, you very well may know the whole story. King and Queen of Thebes, and I'm going to probably forget some of their names as we go along. I'm sorry, I should have looked them up. I know them well. I've read and I've taught this so often. Jocasta is the queen. I forget the king's name. King of Thebes. King and Queen of Thebes had a baby boy, which is great, of course, because my gosh, everyone wants a boy to be the heir to the throne of Thebes. And of course, at the time they thought, we need to find out what this boy's fate's going to be. So they go to the oracle, these Greek fortune tellers. The oracles in Greek culture are very important. You go and the Delphic oracle's very famous statement is "Know thyself." Know thyself. It's an oracle statement. It's very difficult to know yourself. Anyway, They went to the oracle. Said, okay, what's the fate of our child? And the oracle said, oh, the fate of your child is that your child will kill his father and marry his mother. And Yocasta and her husband, whose name I can't remember, were horrified. They said, no way. This is not going to happen. We can thwart fate. I don't care what the oracle says. We know what the oracle is saying is going to happen. We can prevent that from happening. We can get rid of this child. We can just kill this child, and that will never happen. So they agreed to do that. They agreed to kill their son, whom they had named Oedipus. Actually, I don't even think they named him Oedipus yet. So Jocasta said, don't worry, I'll take care of it. So Jocasta said, this is my baby. I don't really want to kill him. So she called one of her servants and said, take this child and go kill it. Get rid of it. Okay? I'm hoping that you will. So she gives it to her servant. He goes out. And as he's going out, he runs into this shepherd far away, in the Theban hinterland, so to speak, in the pastures and everything. So it's a long way away from Thebes. And he says, this is a sweet little baby. Killing this baby, that's horrible. And he sees this shepherd who was there and started talking and found out that the shepherd and his wife didn't have any children. He said, well, would you be willing to adopt this child and raise it as your own? I said, sure, that'd be great. This is a miracle. It's an answer to prayer. So that's what he does. And the servant goes back, and Jocasta says, is the deed done? He says, yes, the deed's done. Because he thought, there's no way this is ever going to come back. Well, then, so Oedipus grows up with his mother and father, the shepherd. And when he gets to be, 20, I'm not sure how old he is, but, vibrant young man, he says, I want to know what my fate is. So he goes to the oracle. He says, what's my fate? And the oracle says, your fate is to kill your father and marry your mother. And he's horrified. I love my mother and father. I will thwart fate. I will not let this happen. I'm going to leave right now. So he gets himself all ready and he leaves. Now he's heard of Thebes, and there's actually a problem in Thebes because Thebes is being besieged by the Sphinx. Sphinx, this mythical character, creature with a lion's body, eagle's wings, a human head. And the Sphinx was allowing people to leave Thebes, but not allowing anyone into Thebes. So the Thebans were starving and suffering and didn't know what to do. And so Oedipus says, I'll go to Thebes and see if I can deal with the Sphinx, because that is a way to create perhaps a glorious future for me. So he starts off to Thebes. Now, while he's doing that, the king in Jocasta trying to figure out what to do. And so the king said, I will leave Thebes and I'll try to find a solution. And I'll do so as a penitent, because obviously we've done something not right and we're being punished with the Sphinx. So he dresses as a poor pilgrim and sets off from Thebes. Now, as Oedipus is traveling to Thebes, the king of Thebes is traveling away from Thebes, and they meet on the road. So Oedipus is this brash young man, prideful young man, who says, hello, sir, please get out of the way so I can pass. And the beggar, who's actually the king of Thebes, so he has the attitude and mentality of the king, but yet he's dressed and poses. The beggar says, no way, you get out of my way. And Oedipus, no, you get out of my way. Leads to a tussle. Oedipus kills the beggar. Yeah, you see it. Killed the king of Thebes. He killed his biological father. Completely unknowingly. Makes his way then further into Thebes and deals with the Sphinx. He answers the Sphinx's question. the riddle, because that was the rule. She was not going to allow anyone in unless they could answer her riddle. And the riddle was, what animal is there who walks on 2 legs, 3 legs, and 4 legs, is weakest when it walks on 4, is strongest when it walks on 2. And Oedipus came up with a solution. Man, we're humans. She says, well, explain. Well, they walk on 4 legs when they're babies and crawling, walk on 3 legs when they're elderly, walking with a cane, and when they're strong, they walk with 2 legs. And the Sphinx, like, how can anybody answer my riddle? And throws itself off of the cliff and goes tumbling down and dies. And Oedipus enters the city to great acclamation because he has just freed Thebes from the Sphinx. So he's there, wonderful, wonderful. He realizes after the great celebration and him being heralded as the hero that there's a problem because the king is not around and the king has been missing and doesn't know what to do. So what do they do? He said, well, we should probably just say he's lost and he's never come back. And therefore, because you freed the city, you should be the king of the city. And as king of the city, you should marry the queen. So Oedipus marries the queen. Okay, age difference be damned, right? If you're going to be king and can marry the queen, fine. So he marries the queen. And things are fine at first, but then they keep getting worse and worse and worse. And the king, of course, never reappears. And so it turns out that Oedipus and Jocasta, so what are we going to do about this? We have to save our people. So it's like, what do we do? And so they said, why don't we bring in the seer Tiresias? Bring in the seer Tiresias. He said, well, the problem is, Your Majesties, the king was killed, murdered, and his murderer has never been brought to justice. It's like, what? So Oedipus, in his brashness, says, I vow to find the culprit who killed the king. So they went looking and looking, can't find anything. And then they said, okay. Things are getting worse and worse. So they bring Tiresias back. He says, well, can you tell us anything more? He says, actually, I can. He says, if you want to find the king's murderer, look in the mirror. He says, what? Threatens to, put Tiresias to death. What are you talking about? And he says, yes, talk to a shepherd knows the truth. So via, they go and find the shepherd. The queen asks her servant. The servant admits, no, I did not kill the child. I gave it to the shepherd. Shepherd comes back and says, yes, I got the child. His name is Oedipus. The whole story comes out, and as it does, Oedipus is horrified and sickened. He had done exactly what his fate was. He had killed his father and married his mother, even though his mother and father did everything they thought they could to thwart his fate, and even though Oedipus himself did everything he could to thwart his fate, it happened anyway, and Oedipus gouges out his eyes. It is a pathetic, horrible, tragic outcome, and Jocasta ends up killing herself. And the chorus in the drama, the written drama, chorus is kind of like the commentator, the narrator. The chorus says, that is why I will call no man happy until the end, because look at Oedipus. Brash, brave, lauded as the hero, as the savior, and he was brought down by fate. What was his tragic flaw? Was it his fault? Well, his tragic flaw was his pride. What was his mother and father's tragic flaw? Their pride in trying to thwart fate. Fate kind of rules. It's a pathetic situation. But here we have Tiresias, who was already there in Homer, the blind seer who revealed the truth of Oedipus, even though he's blind. And what did Oedipus do? Oedipus could see just fine. When he found out the truth, he gouged out his eyes. This ambivalence of seeing, and what do we see, and what is truth, and how do we understand that altogether, is kind of part and parcel of the Greek soul. the Greek identity, the Greek world, that ambiguity which is there too with Helen. Is Helen this or that? Is blind, seeing, seer? How does it all work together? And that too is expressed in philosophy, or at least in Plato's philosophy. I think I'm going to stop here, make a break, and I'll finish the lecture in the next segment, which I'll try to, maybe as long or even longer, but I'll try to deal with it. So I have a break here, so this will be week 3, lecture 1, part 1. We'll pick up here with part 2, and hopefully there won't be a part 3. But as I said at the beginning, this will all come out in the wash, so to speak, in terms of the time. But this is extra time for this week, and I hope we can all accept that and deal with that. And actually, it makes it better because if this were an in-class lecture, I would have to cut it off, and it'd be a problem. And I can't make up in a future lecture the time that I spend too much. Don't worry about it. This overall, you will, I think, be fine with the time. But this is going to be an extra amount of time for this week. But thank you so much for your patience, and I'll be back before too long. I'm going to take a little break myself with the rest of this lecture. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.